Welcome to Sniper's Rest. Sniper's Rest is the last best rest stop in the here and there, the place between where you're coming from and where you're going. I'm Sniper Shadow, and I reside here in Sniper's Rest as a guide and custodian to those who pass through here. I visit the worlds within the multiverse often, but I'm always here to guide and care for the travelers such as yourself that pass through the here and there. Welcome, my friend! Yes, it has been a rather long week. Sometimes life throws so much at you, it feels like a landslide. Just remember, one foot in front of the other. You'll get through it. You can rest here whenever you need before continuing your journey. Today, we continue reading the series of short stories by H.P. Lovecraft. This tale is one of Lovecraft's last stories before his passing. It was written in 1935 and published in the December 1936 edition of Weird Tales. Let's see what horrors await us in The Haunter of the Dark. The Haunter of the Dark, dedicated to Robert Bloch. I have seen the dark universe yawning, where the black planets roll without aim, where they roll in their horror unheeded, without knowledge or luster or name. Cautious investigators will hesitate to challenge the common belief that Robert Blake was killed by lightning, or by some profound nervous shock derived from an electrical discharge. It is true that the window he faced was unbroken, but nature has shewn herself capable of many freakish performances. The expression on his face may have easily arisen from some obscure muscular source unrelated to anything he saw, while the entries in his diary are clearly a result of a fantastic imagination aroused by certain local superstitions and by certain old matters he had uncovered. As for the anomalous conditions at the deserted church on Federal Hill, the shrewd analyst is not slow in attributing them to some chalantry, conscious or unconscious, with at least some of which Blake was secretly connected. For after all, the victim was a writer and a painter wholly devoted to a field of myth, dream, terror, and superstition, and avid in his quest for scenes and effects of a bizarre, spectral sort. His earlier stay in the city, a visit to a strange old man as deeply given to occult and forbidden lore as he, had ended amidst death and flame, and it must have been some morbid instinct which drew him back to his home in Milwaukee. He may have known of the old stories despite his statements to the contrary in the diary, and his death may have nipped in the bud some stupendous hoax destined to have literacy reflection. Among those, however, who have examined and correlated all this evidence, there remain several who cling to less rational and commonplace theories. They are inclined to take much of Blake's diary at its face value, and point significantly to certain facts such as the undoubted geniuses of the old church record, the verified existence of the disliked and unorthodox Starry Wisdom sect prior to 1877, the recorded disappearance of an inquisitive reporter named Edwin M. Lillibridge in 1893, and above all, the look of monstrous transfiguring fear on the face of the young writer when he died. It was one of those believers who, moved to fanatical extremes, threw into the bay the curiously angled stone and its strangely adorned metal box found in the old church steeple, the black windowless steeple, and not the tower where Blake's diary said those things originally were. Though widely censured, both officially and unofficially, this man, a reputable physician with a taste for odd folklore, averred that he had rid the earth of something too dangerous to rest upon it. Between these two schools of opinion, the reader must judge for himself. The papers have given the tangible details of the skeptical angle, leaving for others the drawing of a picture as Robert Blake saw it, or thought he saw it, or pretended to see it. Now, studying the diary closely, dispassionately, and at leisure, let us summarize the dark chain of events that express the point of view of their chief actor. Young Blake returned to Providence in the winter of 1934 and 1935, taking the upper floor of a venerable dwelling in the grassy court off College Street, on the crest of the great eastward hill near the Brown University campus and behind the marble John Hay Library. It was cozy and fascinating place in a little garden oasis of village-like antiquity, where huge friendly cats sunned themselves atop convenient shed. The square Gregorian house had a monitor roof, classic doorway with fan carving, small paned windows, and other earmarks of early 19th century workmanship. Inside were 6-panel doors, wide floorboards, a curving colonial staircase, wide Adam period mantels, and a rear set of rooms, 3 steps below the general level. Blake's study, a large southwestward chamber, overlooked the front garden on one side, while its west windows, before one of which his desk, faced off from the brow of the hill, and commanded a splendid view of the lower town's outspread roofs, and of the mystical sunsets that flamed behind them. On the far horizon were the open countryside's purple slopes. Against these, some 2 miles away, rose the spectral hump of federal hill, bristling with huddled roofs and steeples, whose remote outlines wavered mysteriously, taking fantastic forms as the smoke of the city swelled up and enmeshed them. Blake had a curious sense that he was looking upon some unknown ethereal world which might or might not vanish in a dream if he ever tried to seek it out and enter it in person. Having sent home for most of his books, Blake brought some antique furniture suitable to his quarters and settled down to write and paint, living alone and attending to simple housework himself. His studio was a north attic room, where the panes of the monitor's roof furnished admirable lighting. During that first winter, he produced 5 of his best-known short stories: The Burrower Beneath, The Staircases in the Crypt, The Shagai, The Vale of Penaf, and The Feaster from the Stars, and painted 7 canvases, studies of nameless, unhuman monsters and profoundly alien, non-terrestrial landscapes. At sunset, he would often sit at his desk and gaze dreamily off to the outspread west, the dark towers of Memorial Hall just below, the Gregorian Courthouse, the Belfry, the lofty pinnacles of downtown section, and that shimmering spire-crowned mound in the distance, whose unknown streets and labyrinth gables so potently provoked his fancy. From his few local acquaintances he learned that the far-off slope was a vast Italian quarter, though most of the houses were remnants of old Yankee and Irish days. Now and then he would train his field glasses on that spectral, unreachable world beyond the curling smoke, picking out individual roofs and chimneys and steeples and speculating upon the bizarre and curious mysteries that they might house. Even with the optical aid, Federal Hill seemed somehow alien, half fabulous, and linked to the unreal, intangible marvels of Blake's own tales and pictures. The feeling would persist long after the hill had faded into the violet, lamp-starred twilight, and the courthouse floodlights and the red industrial trust beacon had blazed, make up the night grotesque. Of all the distant objects on Federal Hill, a certain huge dark church most fascinated Blake. It stood out with an especial distinctness in certain hours of the day, and at sunset the great tower and the tapering steeple loomed blackly against the flaming sky. It seemed to rest on especially high ground, for the grim facade and the obliquely seen northern side with sloping roofs and the tops of great pointed windows rose boldly above the tangle of surrounding ridgepoles and chimney pots. Peculiarly grim and austere, it appeared to be built of stone, stained and weathered with the smoke and storms of a century or more. The style, so far as the glass could shew, was the earliest experimental form of Gothic revival which preceded the stately period and held over some of the outlines and proportions of the Gregorian age. Perhaps it was reared around 1810 or 1815. As months passed, Blake watched the far-off forbidden structure with an oddly mounting interest. Since the vast windows were never lighted, he knew that it must be vacant. The longer he watched, the more his imagination worked, till at length he began to fancy curious things. He believed that a vague, singular aura of desolation hovered over the place, so that even the pigeons and the swallows shunned its smoky eaves. Around the other towers and belfries his glass would reveal great flocks of birds, but here they never rested. At least that is what he thought, and set down his diary. He pointed the place to several friends, but none of them had ever been on Federal Hill or possessed the faintest notion of what the church was or had been. In the spring, a deep restlessness gripped Blake. He had begun his long-planned novel, based on a supposed survival of a witch cult in Maine, but was strangely unable to make progress with it. More and more he would sit at his westward window and gaze at the distant hill and the black, frowning steeples shunned by the birds, when the delicate leaves came out on the garden boughs, and the world was filled with a new beauty. But Blake's restlessness was merely increased. It was then that he first thought of crossing the city and climbing boldly up that fabulous slope into the smoke-wreathed world of dream. Late in April, just before the aeon-shadowed Warplug's time, Blake made his first trip into the unknown. Plodding through the endless downtown streets and the bleak decayed squares beyond, he came finally upon the ascending avenue of century-worn steps, sagging Doric porches, and Belier-paned cupolas, which he felt must lead up to the long-known, unreachable world beyond the mists. There were dingy blue and white street signs which meant nothing to him, and presently he noted the strange dark faces of the drifting crowds and the foreign signs over curious shops in a brown, decade-weathered building. Nowhere could he find any of the objects he had seen from afar, so that once he half fancied that the Federal Hill of that distant view was a dream world never to be trod by human living feet. Now and then the battered church facade or crumbling spire came into sight, but never the blackened pile that he sought. When he asked a shopkeeper about the great stone church, the man smiled and shook his head, though he spoke English freely. As Blake climbed higher, the region seemed stranger and stranger, with bewildering mazes of brooding brown alleys leading eternally off to the south. He crossed 2 or 3 broad avenues, and once thought he glimpsed a familiar tower. Again he asked a merchant about the massive Church of Stone, and this time he could have sworn that the plea of ignorance was feigned. The dark man's face had a look of fear which he tried to hide, and Blake saw him make a curious sign with his right hand. Then suddenly a black spire stood out against the cloudy sky on his left, above the tiers of brown roofs lining the tangled southern alleys. Blake knew at once what it was, and plunged towards it through the squalid, unpaved lanes that climb from the avenue. Twice he lost his way, but he somehow dared not to ask any other patriarchs or housewives who sat on their doorsteps, or any of the children who shouted and played in the mud of the shadowy lanes. At last he saw the tower plain against the southwest. A huge stone bulk rose darkly at the end of an alley. Presently he stood in a windswept open square, quaintly cobblestoned, with a high bank wall on the farther side. This was the end of his quest, for upon the wide, iron-railed, weed-grown plateau, which the wall supported, a separate, lesser world raised fully 6 feet above surrounding streets, there stood a grim Titan bulk whose identity, despite Blake's new perspective, was beyond dispute. The vacant church was in a state of great decrepitude. Some of the high stone buttresses had fallen, and several delicate fanals lay half-long amongst the brown and neglected weeds and grasses. The sooty Gothic windows were largely unbroken, though many of the stone mullions were missing. Blake wondered how the obscurely painted panes could survive so well, in view of known habits of small boys the world over. The massive doors were intact and tightly closed. Around the top of the bank wall, fully enclosing the grounds, was a rusty iron fence whose gate, at the head of a flight of steps from the square, was visibly padlocked. The path from the gate to the building was completely overgrown. Desolation and decay hung like a pall above the place, and in the birdless eaves and the black ivyless walls Blake felt a touch of dimly sinister beyond his power to define. There were very few people in the square, but Blake saw a policeman at the northern end and approached him with questions about the church. He was a great, wholesome Irishman, and seemed odd that he would do a little more than make the sign of the cross and mutter that people never spoke of that building. When Blake pressed him, he said very hurriedly that the Italian priest warned everybody against it, vowing that a monstrous evil had once dwelt there and left its mark. He himself had heard dark whispers of it from his father, who recalled certain sounds and rumours from his boyhood. There had been a bad sect there in the old days, an outlawed sect that called up awful things from some unknown gulf of night. It had taken a good priest to exorcise what had come, though there did be those who said that merely the light could do it. If Father O'Malley were alive, there would be many a thing he could tell, but now there was nothing to do but let it alone. It hurt nobody now, and those that owned it were dead or far away. They had run like rats away from the threatening talk in 77 when people began to mind the way folks vanished now and then in the neighborhood. Some day the city would step in and take the property for lack of heirs, but little good would come of anybody's touching it. Better it be left alone for the years to topple, lest be stirred that ought to rest forever in their black abyss. After the policeman had gone, Blake stood staring at the sullen, steeped pile. It excited him to find that the structure seemed as sinister to others as to him, and he wondered what grain of truth might lie behind the old tales the bluecoat had repeated. Probably there were mere legends evoked by the evil look of the place, but even so, they were like a strange coming to life of one of his own stories. The afternoon sun came out from behind, dispersing the clouds, but it seemed to be unable to light up the stained, sooty walls of the old temple that towered on its high plateau. It was odd that the green of the spring had not touched the brown, withered growths in the raised iron fence yard. Blake found himself edging nearer to the raised area and examining the bank wall and the rusted fence for possible avenues of ingress. There was a terrible lure about the blackened fane, which was not to be resisted. The fence had no opening near the steps, but around the north side there were some missing bars. He could go up the steps and walk around on the narrow coping outside the fence till he came to the gap. If the people feared the place so wisely, he would counter no interference. He was on the embankment and almost inside before anyone noticed him. Then, looking down, he saw a few people in the square edging away and making the same sign with their right hand that the shopkeeper in the avenue had made. Several windows were slammed down, and a fat woman darted into the street and pulled some small children inside a rickety, unpainted house. The gap in the fence was very easy to pass through, and before long Blake found himself wading amongst the rotting, tangled growths of the deserted yard. Here and there a worn stump of a headstone told him that this had once been burials in this field, but that he must have been very long ago. The sheer bulk of the church was oppressive now he was close to it, but conquered his mood and approached to try the 3 giant doors in the facade. They were all securely locked, so he began a circuit of the cyclopean building to quest some minor, more penetrable opening. Even then, he could not be sure that he wished to enter the haunt of desertion and shadow, yet the pull of its strangeness dragged him on automatically. A yawning and unprotected cellar window was with rusted furniture, the needed aperture. Peering in, Blake saw a subterranean gulf of cobwebs and dust faintly litten with western sun-filtered rays. Debris, old barrels, ruined boxes, and furniture of numerous sorts met his eye, though over everything lay a shroud of dust which softened in all sharp outlines. The rusted remains of the hot air furnace shewed that the building had been used and kept in shape as late as the mid-Victorian times. Acting almost without conscious initiative, Blake crawled through the window and let himself down into the dust-carpeted and debris-strewn concrete floor. The vaulted cellar was a vast one, without partitions, and in the corner to the far right, amid the dense shadows, he saw a black archway evidently leading upstairs. He felt a peculiar sense of oppression at being actually within the great spectral building, but kept it in check as he cautiously scouted about, finding a still intact barrel amid the dust and rolling it over to the open window to provide for his exit. Then, bracing himself, he crossed the wide, cobweb-festooned space towards the arch. Half choked with the omnipresent dust and covered with ghostly gossamer fibres, he reached and began to climb the worn stone steps which rose into the darkness. He had no light, but groped carefully with his hands. After a sharp turn, he felt a closed door ahead, and a little fumbling revealed its ancient latch. It opened inwards, and beyond he saw a dimly illuminated corridor lined with worm-eaten panelling. Once on the ground floor, Blake began exploring in a rapid fashion. All inner doors were unlocked, so he freely passed from room to room. The colossal nave was almost eldritch, placed with its drift and mountains of dust over box, pews, altar, hourglass puplet, and sounding board, and its titanic ropes of cobwebs stretching amongst pointed arches of the gallery and entwining in the clustered Gothic columns. Over all this hushed desolation played a hideous leaden light, as the declining sun sent rays through the strange, half-blackened panes of the great aspidal windows. The paintings on those windows were so obscured by soot that Blake could scarcely decipher what they had represented, but from the little he could make out, he did not like them. The designs were largely conventional, and his knowledge of obscure symbolism told him much concerning some of the ancient patterns. A few saints depicted bore expressions distinctly open to criticism, while one of these windows seemed to shew merely a dark space with spirals of curiously luminosity scattered about within. Turning away from the windows, Blake noticed the cobwebbed cross above the altar was not of the ordinary kind, but represented the primordial Ankh or crux and Nazca from the shadowy Egypt. In the rear vestry room, beside the asp, Blake found a rotting desk and a ceiling-high shelf of mildewed, disintegrating books. Here, for the first time, he received a positive shock of objective horror, for the titles of those books told him much. They were the black, forbidden things which most sane people have never even heard of, or have heard of only in fugitive, timid whispers. The banned and dreaded repositories of equivocal secrets and immemorial formulae which have trickled down the stream from time to time from the days of man's youth, and the dim, fabulous days before man was. He himself had read many of them, a Latin version of the abhorred Necronomicon, the sinister Liber Ivonis, the infamous Cults de Gules of Comete dere Elite, the Unsplash Kulten of von Jutz, and old Ludwig Prinz Hellish de Vemis Mysteris. But there were others he had known merely by reputation or not at all. The Panacotic manuscripts, the Book of Dazan, and the crumbling volume in wholly unidentifiable characters, yet with certain symbols and diagrams shudderingly recognizable to the occult student. Clearly, the lingering local rumors had not lied. This place had once been a seat of an evil older than mankind and wider than the known universe. In the ruined desk was a small leather-bound record book filled with entries in some odd cryptographic medium. The manuscript writing consisted of the common traditional symbols used in today's astronomy and ancient alchemy, astrology, and other dubious arts. The devices of the moon, sun, planets, aspects, and zodiac signs, here massed in a solid pages of text, with divisions and paragraphs suggesting that each symbol answered to some alphabetical letter. In the hopes of later solving the cryptogram, Blake bore off this volume in his coat pocket. Many of the great tomes on the shelves fascinated him unutterably, and he felt tempted to borrow them all at some later time. However, he wondered how they could have remained undisturbed for so long. Was he the first to conquer the clutching, pervasive fear which had for nearly 60 years protected this deserted place from visitors? Having now thoroughly explored the ground floor, Blake ploughed again through the dust of the spectral nave to the front vestibule, where he had seen a door and a staircase presumably leading up to the blackened tower and steeple, objects so long familiar to him at a distance. The ascent was a choking experience, for dust lay thick, and while the spiders had done their worst on the constricted place, the staircase was a spiral with high, narrow wooden treads, and now and then Blake passed a clouded window looking dizzily out over the city. Though he had seen no ropes below, he expected to find a bell or peal of bells in the tower whose narrow, louver-boarded lancet windows in his field glass he had studied so often. Here he was doomed to disappointment, for when he attained the top of the stairs he found the tower chamber vacant of chimes, and clearly devoted to vastly different purposes. The room was about 15 feet square, which faintly lighted by 4 lancet windows, one on each side, which were glazed with their screening of decay's louver boards. These had been further fitted with tight, opaque screens, but the latter were now largely rotted away. In the center of the dust-laden floor rose a curiously angled stone pillar some 4 feet in height and 2 in average diameter, covered on each side with bizarre, crudely incised and wholly unrecognized hieroglyphs. On the pillar rested a metal box of peculiarly asymmetrical form, its hinged lid thrown back, and its interior holding what looked like a decade-deep dust to be an egg-shaped or irregularly spherical object some 4 inches through. Around the pillar, in a rough circle, were 7 high-backed Gothic chairs largely intact, while behind them, ranging along the dark-panelled walls, were 7 colossal images of crumbling, black-painted plaster resembling, more than anything else, to be cryptic carven megaliths of mysterious Easter Island. One of the corner of the cobweb chamber was a ladder built into the wall, leading up to a closed trap door of the windowless steeple above. Blake grew accustomed to the feeble light. He noticed odd bas-reliefs on the strange open box of yellowish metal. Approaching, he tried to clear the dust away with his hand or an handkerchief, and saw that the figurines were of monstrous and utterly alien kind, depicting entities which, though seemingly alive, resembled no known life form ever evolved on this planet. The 4-inch seeming sphere turned out to be a nearly black, red-strated polyhedron, with many irregular flat surfaces, either a very remarkable crystal of some sort, or an artificial object of carved and highly polished mineral matter. It did not touch the bottom of the box, but was held suspended by means of a metal band around its center, with 7 queerly designed supports extending horizontally to angles of the box's inner wall near the top. This stone, once exposed, exerted upon Blake an almost alarming fascination. He could scarcely tear his eyes away from it, and as he looked at its glistening surfaces, he almost fancied that it was transparent, with half-formed worlds of wonder within. Into his mind floated pictures of alien orbs with great stone towers, and other orbs with Taton mountains and no mark of life, and still remoter spaces where only a stirring in vague blackness told of a presence of conscience and will. When he did look away, it was to notice a somewhat singular mound of dust in the far corner near the ladder to the steeple. Just why it took his attention he could not tell, but something in its contours carried a message to his unconscious mind. Ploughing towards it and brushing aside the hanging cobwebs as he went, he began to discern something grim about it. A hand and handkerchief soon revealed the truth, and Blake gasped with a baffling mixture of emotions. It was a human skeleton, and it must have been there for a very long time. The clothing was in shreds, but some buttons and fragments of cloth bespoke a man's grey suit. There were other bits of evidence: shoes, metal clasps, huge buttons for round cuffs, a stick pin of a bygone pattern, a reporter's badge with the name of the old Providence telegram, a crumbling leather pocketbook. Blake examined the letter with care, finding it several bills of antiquated issues, a celluloid advertising calendar for 1893, some cards with the name Edward M. Lillibridge, and a paper covered with a penciled memoranda. This paper held much of a puzzling nature, and Blake read it carefully in the dim westward window. Its disjointed text included such phrases as the following: Professor Enoch Bowen, home from Egypt, May 1844, buys old Free Will Church in July, his archaeological work and studies in the occult, well known. Dr. Drown of Fourth Baptist warns against starry wisdom in sermon, December 29, 1844. Congregation 97 by the end of 45. 1846, 3 disappearances. First mention of shining trapezoidorion. 7 disappearances. 1848, stories of blood sacrifices begin. Investigation 1853 comes to nothing. Stories of sounds. Friar O'Malley tells of devil worship with box found in great Egyptian ruins. Says they call up something that can't exist in the light. Flees a little light and banished by strong light. That then has to be summoned again. Probably got this from deathbed confession of Francis X. Feeney, who had joined Starry Wisdom in 49. These people say shining trapezoidron shews them heaven and other worlds, and that the haunter of the dark tells them secrets in some way. Story of Orrin B. Eddy, 1857. They call it up by gazing at the crystal, and have a secret language of their own. 200 or more in congregation, 1863, exclusive of men at front. Irish boys mob church in 1869 after Patrick Regan's disappearance. Veiled article in J, March 14, 1872, but people don't talk about it. 6 disappearances, 1876. Secret committee calls on Mayor Doyle. Action promised February 1877. Church closures in April. Gang Federal Hill Boys threatened doctor and vestryman in May. 181 persons leave city before end of 1877. Mention no names. Ghost stories begin around 1880. Try to ascertain truth of report that no human being has entered the church since 1877. Ask Langan for photographs of the place taken in 1851. Restoring the paper to the pocketbook and placing the latter in his coat, Blake turned to look down at the skeleton in the dust. The implications of the notes were clear. There could be no doubt but this man had come to the deserted edifice 42 years before in quest of a newspaper sensation, which no one else had been bold enough to attempt. Perhaps no one had known of his plan, who could tell? But he had never returned to his paper. Had some bravely suppressed fear risen to overcome him and bring on sudden heart failure? Blake stooped over the gleaming bones and noted their peculiar state. Some of them were badly scattered, a few seeming oddly dissolved at the ends. Others were strangely yellowed with vague suggestions of charring. This charring extends to some of the fragments of clothing. The skull was in a very peculiar state, stained yellow with a charred aperture in the top, as if some powerful acid had eaten through solid bone. What had happened to the skeleton during its 4 decades of silent entombment here, Blake could not imagine. Before he realized it, he was looking at the stone again and letting his curious influence call up nebulous pageantry in his mind. He saw processions of robed hook figures whose outlines were not human, and looked on endless leagues of desert lined with carved, sky-reaching monoliths. He saw towers and walls, nighted depths under the sea, vortices of space where wisps of black mist floated before thin shimmering of cold purple haze. And beyond all else, he glimpsed an infinite gulf of darkness, where solid and semi-solid forms were known only by their winding strings, and cloud patterns of force seeming to superimpose order on chaos and hold forth a key to all paradoxes and arcana of the world we know. Then all at once the spell was broken by an access of gnawing, intermittent panic fear. Blake choked and turned away from the stone, conscious of some formless alien presence close to him and watching him with horrid intentness. He felt entangled with something that was not in the stone, but which had looked through it at him. Something which would ceaselessly follow him with cognition that was not physical sight. Plainly, the place was getting on his nerves, as well as it might in the gruesome find. The light was waning, too, and since he had no illuminant with him, he knew he would have to be leaving soon. It was then, in the gathering twilight, that he thought he saw a faint trace of luminosity in the crazily angled stone. He had tried to look away from it, but some obscure compulsion drew his eyes back. Was there a subtle phosphorescence of radioactivity about the thing? What was it that the dead man's notes had said concerning the shining trapezoedron? What, anyway, was the abandoned lair of cosmic evil? And what had been done here, and what might be still lurking in the bird-shunned shadows? It seemed now as if an elusive touch of forte had arisen somewhere close by. And though its source was not apparent, Blake seized the cover of the long open box and snapped it down. It moved easily on its alien hinges and closed completely over the unmistakably glowing stone. At the sharp click of that closing, a soft stirring sound seemed to come from the steeple's eternal blackness overhead, beyond the trap door. Rats, without question, the only living things to reveal their presence in this accursed pile, since he had entered it. And yet that stirring in the steeple frightened him horribly, so that he plunged almost wildly down the spiral stairs, across the ghoulish nave, and into the vaulted basement. Out amidst the gathering dusk of the deserted square and down through the teeming, fear-haunted alleys and avenues of Federal Hill towards the sane central streets and the home-like brick sidewalks of the college district. During the days that followed, Blake told no one of his expedition. Instead, he read much in certain books, examined long years of newspaper files downtown, and worked feverishly at the cryptogram that the leather volume from the cobweb-vestried room. The cipher he soon saw was no simple one, and after a long period of endeavour he felt sure that its language could not be English, Latin, Greek, French, Spanish, Italian, or German. Evidently, he would have to draw upon the deepest wells of his strange erudition. Every evening the old impulse to gaze westward returned, and he saw the black steeples as of yore amongst the bristling roofs of a distant and half-fabulous world. But now it held a fresh note of terror for him. He knew the heritage of evil lore it masked, and with the knowledge his vision ran riot in queer, new ways. The birds of spring were returning, and as he watched their sunset flights, he fancied they avoided the gaunt, lone spire as never before. When a flock of them approached it, he thought they would wheel and scatter in panicked confusion, and he could only guess at the wild twitterings which failed to reach him across the intervening miles. It was in June that Blake's diary told of his victory over the cryptogram. The text was, he found, in the dark Aklo language, used by certain cults of evil antiquity, and known to him in halting way through previous researches. The diary is strangely reticent about what Blake deciphered, but he was patently awed and disconcerted by his results. There are references to the haunter of the dark, awakened by gazing into the shining trapezoidron, and insane conjectures about the black gulfs of chaos from which it is called. The being is spoken as of holding all knowledge and demanding monstrous sacrifices. Some of Blake's entries shew fear lest the thing, which he seemed to regard as summoned, stalk abroad, though he adds that the streetlights from a bulwark which cannot be crossed. Of the shining trapezoidron he often speaks, calling it a window on all time and space, and tracing its history from the days when it was fashioned on dark Yugoth, before ever the old ones brought it to earth. It was treasured and placed in its curious box by the cryptoid things of Antarctica, salvaged from their ruins by the serpent man of Ulsala, and peered at aeons later in Lemuria by the first human beings. It crossed strange lands and stranger seas, and sank with Atlantis before Minian, a fisher, meshed it in his net and sold it to a swarthy merchant from the nighted Kerm. The pharaoh Nefren-Ka built around it a temple with a windowless crypt, and it did that which caused his name to be stricken from all monuments and records. Then it slept in the ruins of the evil fane which priests and the new pharaoh destroyed, till its delvers spade once more and brought it forth to curse mankind. In early July, the newspapers oddly supplement Blake's entries, though in so brief and casual a way that his diary has called the general attention to their contribution. It appears that a new fear has been growing on Federal Hill since a stranger entered the dreaded church. The Italians whispered of unaccustomed stirrings and bumpings and scrapings in the windowless steeple, and called on their priests to banish an entity which haunted their dreams. Something, they said, was constantly watching at a door to see if it was dark enough to venture forth. Press items mentioned the long-standing local superstitions, but failed to shed as much light on the earlier background of the horror. It was obvious that the young reporters of the day are no antiquarians. In writing these things, in his diary, Blake expresses a curious kind of remorse and talks of the duty of burying the shining trapezoidron and banishing what had evoked it by letting daylight into the hideous jutting spire. At the same time, however, he displays a dangerous extent of his fascination and admits a morbid longing, pervading even his dreams, to visit the accursed tower and gaze again into the cosmic secrets of the glowing stone. Then something in the journal on the morning of July 17 threw the diarist into a veritable fever of horror. It was only a variant of other half-humorous items about Federal Hill restlessness, but to Blake it was somehow very terrible indeed. In the night, a thunderstorm had put the city's lighting system out of commission for a full hour, and in that black intervals the Italians had nearly gone mad with fright. Those living near the dreaded church had sworn the thing in the steeple had taken advantage of the street lamp's absence and gone down into the body of the church, flopping and bumping around in a viscous, altogether dreadful way. Towards the last it had bumped up to the tower where the sounds of shattering glass. It could go wherever the darkness reached, but light would always send it fleeing. When the current blazed on again, there had been a shocking commotion in the tower, for even the feeble light trickling through the grime-blackened louver-boarded windows was too much for the thing. It had bumped and slithered up into its tenebrous steeple just in time, for a long dose of light would have sent it back to the abyss whence the crazy stranger had called it. During the dark hour, praying crowds had clustered around the church in the rain with lighted candles and lamps somehow shielded with folds of paper and umbrellas. A guard of light saved the city from the nightmare that stalks in the darkness. Once those nearest to the church declared the outer door rattled hideously. But this was not even the worst. That evening in the bulletin, Blake read of what the reporters had found. Aroused at last to the whimsical news of values and scare, a pair of them had defied the frantic crowds of Italians and crawled through into the church cellar window, trying the doors in vain. They found the dust of the vestibule and the spectral nave ploughed up in a singular way, with bits of rotted cushions and satin pew linings scattered curiously around. There was a bad odour everywhere, and here and there were bits of yellow stain and patches of what looked like charring. Opening the door to the tower and pausing a moment at the suspicion of scraping sound above, they found the narrow spiral staircase wiped thoroughly clean. In the tower, its similarly half-swept conditions existed. They spoke of heptagonal stone pillar, overturned Gothic chairs, and a bizarre plaster of images, though, strangely enough, in the metal box and the mutilated skeletons were not mentioned. What disturbed Blake the most, except for the hints of stains and charring and bad odours, was the final detail that explained the crashing glass. Every one of the tower's lancet windows was broken, and 2 of them had been darkened in a crude and hurried way by stuffing the satin pew linings and cushion horsehair into the spaces between the slanted exterior louverboards. More satin fragments and bunches of horsehair lay scattered around the newly swept floor, as if someone had been interrupted in the act of restoring the tower to the absolute blackness of its tightly curtained days. Yellowish stains and charred patches were found on the ladder to the windowless spire, but when a reporter climbed up, opened the horizontally sliding trapdoor, and shot a feeble flashlight beam into the black and strangely forted space, he saw nothing but darkness, and a heterogeneous litter of shapeless fragments near the aperture. The verdict, of course, was charlatanity. Somebody had played a joke on the superstitious hill-dwellers, or else some fanatic had striven to bolster up their fears for their own good. Or perhaps someone of the younger and more sophisticated dwellers had staged an elaborate hoax on the outside world. There was an amusing aftermath when the police sent an officer to verify the reports. 3 men in succession found ways of evading the assignment, and the 4th went very reluctantly, and returned very soon without adding to the account given by the reporters. From this point onwards, Blake's diary shews a mounting tide of insidious horror and nervous apprehension. He upbraids himself for not doing something, and speculates wildly on the consequences of having another electrical breakdown. It had been verified on 3 occasions during the thunderstorm. He telephoned the electric light company in a frantic vein and asked that desperate precautions against the lapse of power be taken. Now and then his entries shew concern over the failure of the reporters to find the metal box and the stone and the strangely marred old skeleton when they explored the shadowy tower room. He assumed that these things had been removed, whether and by whom or what he could only guess. But his worst fears concerned himself, and the kind of unholy rapport he felt to exist between his mind and that lurking horror in the distant steeple. That monstrous thing of night which his rashness had called out, and the ultimate black spaces. He seemed to feel a consistent tugging at his will, and callers of the period remember how he would sit abstractly at his desk and stare out to the west window at that far-off spire-bristling mound beyond the swirling smoke of the city. His entries dwell monotonously on certain terrible dreams, and of strengthening the unholy rapport in his sleep. There is mention of a night when he awakened to find himself fully dressed, outdoors, and heading automatically down the college hill towards the west. Again and again he dwells on the fact that the thing in the steeple knows where to find him. The week following July 30 is recalled as the time of Blake's partial breakdown. He did not dress and ordered all his food by telephone. His visitors remarked the cords he kept near his bed, and said that his sleepwalking had forced him to bind his ankles every night with knots that would probably hold, or else waken him with the labour of untying. In his diary, he told of the hideous experience which had brought the collapse. After retiring, on the night of the 30th, he had suddenly found himself groping about in an almost black space. All he could see were short, faint horizontal streaks of bluish light, but he could smell an overpowering fetor and hear a curious jumble of soft, furtive sounds above him. When he moved, he stumbled over something, and each noise there would come as a sort of answer from above, a vague stirring mixed with a cautious sliding of wood on wood. Once his groping hands encountered a pillar of stone with a vacant top, whilst later he found himself clutching the rungs of a ladder built into the wall, and fumbling in his uncertainty, he went upwards towards some region of intenser stench where a hot, searing blast beat down against him. Before his eyes a kaleidoscopic range of phantasmal images played, all of them dissolving at intervals into the picture of a vast, unplumbed abyss of night, wherein wells of sun and worlds of even profounder blackness. He thought of the ancient legends of the ultimate chaos, at whose center sprawls the blind idiot god, Azoth, the lord of all things, encircled by his flopping horde of mindless amphimorsis dancers and lulled by the thin, monotonous piping of demonic flute held in the nameless pause. Then a sharp report from the outer world broke through his stupor and roused him to the unutterable horror of his position. What it was he never knew. Perhaps it was some belated peal from the fireworks heard all summer on Federal Hill as the dwellers hailed their victorious patron saints, or the saints of their native villages in Italy. In any event, he shrieked aloud and dropped frantically from the ladder and stumbled blindly across the obstructed floor of the almost lightless chamber that encompassed him. He knew instantly where he was, and plunged recklessly down the narrow spiral staircase, tripping and bruising himself at every turn. There was a nightmare flight through the vast cobwebbed naves whose ghostly arches reached up into realms of leering shadow, a sightless scramble through the littered basement, a climb to regions of air and streetlights outside, and a mad racing down the spectral hill of gibbering gables across the grim and silent city of tall black towers and up the steep eastward precipice to his own ancient door. On regaining consciousness in the morning, he found himself lying on his study floor, fully dressed. Dirt and cobwebs covered him, and every inch of his body seemed sore and bruised. When he faced the mirror, he saw that his hair was badly scorched. A trace of strange evil odor seemed to cling to his outer clothing, and that was when his nerves broke down. Thereafter, lounging exhaustedly about in his dressing gown, he did little but stare from his west window and shiver at the threat of thunder and make wild entries in his diary. A great storm broke just before midnight on August 8th. Lightning struck repeatedly in all parts of the city, and 2 remarkable fireballs were reported. The rain was torrential, while a constant fusillade of thunder brought sleeplessness to thousands. Blake was utterly frantic in his fear for the lighting system and tried to telephone the company around 1 a.m. Though by that time service had temporarily been cut off in the interest of safety, he recorded everything in his diary, the large, nervous, and often undecipherable hieroglyphs telling their own story of growing frenzy and despair, and the entries of scrawled blindly in the dark. He had to keep the house dark in order to see out the window, and it appears that most of his time was spent at his desk, peering anxiously through the rain, glistening miles of downtown roofs and constellations of distant lights marking Federal Hill. Now and then it would go fumbling to make an entry in his diary, so that the detached phrases such as "the lights must not go," "it knows where I am," "I must destroy it," and "it is calling to me, but perhaps it means no injury this time," are found scattered down 2 of the pages. Then the lights went out all over the city. It happened at 2:12 a.m., according to the powerhouse records, but Blake's diary gives no indication of the time. The entry is nearly "lights out. God help me." On Federal Hill there were watchers as anxious as he, and rain-soaked knots of men paraded the squares and alleys around the evil church with umbrella-shaded candles, electric flashlights, oil lanterns, crucifixes, and obscure charms of many sorts common in southern Italy. They blessed each flash of lightning and made cryptical signs of fear with their right hands when a turn in the storm caused the flashes to lessen and finally cease altogether. A rising wind blew out most of the candles, so the scene grew threateningly dark. Some roused Father Mazzullo of Spirito Sant'Anno Church. He hastened to the dismal square to pronounce whatever helpful syllables he could. Of the restless and curious sounds in the blackened tower there could be no doubt whatsoever. For what happened at 2:35 we have the testimony of the priest, a young, intelligent, and well-educated person, of Patrolman Williams J. Mohan of Central Station, an officer of the highest reliability who had paused at the part of his beat to inspect the crowd, and most of the 78 men who gathered around the church's high bank wall, especially those in the square where the eastward facade was visible. Of course, there was nothing which can be proved by being outside the order of nature. The possible causes of such an event are many. No one can speak with certainty of the obscure chemical processes arising in a vat, ancient, ill-aired, and long-deserted building of heterogeneous contents. Metaphysic vapors, spontaneous combustion, pressure of gases born long of decay, and of the numbness of phenomena might be responsible. Then, of course, the factor of conscious chauncey can be no means excluded. The thing was really quite simple in itself, and covered less than 3 minutes of actual time. Father Mazzullo, always a precise man, looked at his watch repeatedly. It started with a definite swelling of the dull fumbling sounds inside the black tower. There had, for some time, been vague exhalation of strange evil odors from the church, and this had now become emphatic and offensive. Then, at last, there was a sound of splintering wood, and a large, heavy object crashed down in the yard beneath the frowning easterly facade. The tower was invisible, now that the candles would not burn, but as the object neared the group of people, knew that it was the smoke-grimed, louver-boarding thing of the tower's east window. Immediately afterward, an utterly unbearable forter welled forth in the unseen heights, choking and sickening the trembling watchers, almost prostrating those in the square. At the same time, the air trembled with a vibration of flapping wings, and a sudden east-blowing wind, more violent than any previous blast, snatched off the hats and wrenched the dripping umbrellas of the crowd. Nothing definite could be seen in the candleless night, though some upwards-looking spectators thought they glimpsed a great spreading of denser blackness against the inky sky, something like a formless cloud of smoke that shot with meteor-like speed towards the east. That was all. The watchers were half numbed with fright, awe, and discomfort, and scarcely knew what to do, or whether to do anything at all. Not knowing what had happened, they did not relax their vigil, and a moment later they sent up a prayer as sharp as a flash of belated lightning, following by an ear-splitting crash of sounds. Rent flooded the heavens. Half an hour later the rain stopped, and in 15 minutes more the streetlights sprang on again, sending the weary, bedraggled watchers relievedly back to their homes. The next day, the papers gave these matters minor attention in conjunction with the general storm reports. It seems that the great lightning flash and the deafening explosion which followed the Federal Hill occurrence were even more tremendous farther east, where a burst of the singular forter was likewise noticed. The phenomenon was most marked over College Hill, where the crash awakened all sleeping inhabitants and led to a bewildering round of speculations. Of those who were already awake, only a few saw the anomalous blaze of light near the top of the hill, or noticed the inexplicable upwards rush of air that almost strips the leaves from the trees, or blasted the plants in the gardens. It was agreed that Lone's sudden bolt of lightning must have struck somewhere in this neighborhood, though no trace of its striking could afterwards be found. A youth of the Tau Omega fraternity house thought he saw a grotesque and hideous mass of smoke in the air just as the preliminary flash burst, but his observation had not been verified. Of the few observers, however, agree that a violent gust from the west had flooded intolerable stench which proceeded belatedly to stroke, while evidence concerning a momentary burnt-out odour of the stroke is equally general. These points were discussed very carefully because of their probable connection with the death of Robert Blake. Students in the Psi Delta house, whose upper rear windows looked into Blake's study, noticed the blurred white face at the western window in the morning of the 9th, and wondered what was wrong with the expression. When they saw the same face in the same position that evening, they felt worried, and they watched for the light to come on in his apartment. Later, they rang the bell of the darkened flat, and finally had a policeman force the door. The rigid body sat bolt upright at the desk by the window. When the intruders saw the glassy, bulging eyes, the marks of stark, convulsive fright twisted on his features, they turned away in sickened dismay. Shortly afterwards, the coroner's physician made examination, and despite the unbroken window, reported electrical shock, or nervous tension induced by electrical discharge, as the cause of death. The hideous expression he ignored altogether, deeming it not probable as a result of profound shock experienced by a person of such abnormal animation and unbalanced emotions. He deduced these latter qualities from books and paintings and manuscripts found in the apartment, and from the blindly scrawled entries in the diary on the desk. Blake had prolonged his frenzied jotting to the last, and the broken, pointed pencil was found clutched in his spasmodically contracted right hand. The entries after the failure of the lights were highly disjointed, only legible in part. From them, certain investigators have drawn conclusions differing greatly from the materialistic official verdict, but such speculations have little chance for belief among the conservative. The case of these imagined theorists have not been helped by the action and superstition of Dr. Dexter, who threw the curious box in the angled stone, an object certainly self-luminous as seen in the blackless window steeple where it was found, into the deepest channel of the Nagasset Bay. Excessive imagination and neurotic unbalanced on Blake's part, aggravated by the knowledge of evil bygone cults whose startling traces he had uncovered, form the dormant interpretation given in those final frenzied jottings. These are the entries, or all that can be made of them. Lights still out. Must be 5 minutes now. Everything depending on lightning. Yardeth grant it will keep up. Some influence seems beating through it. Rain and thunder, wind deafen. The thing is taking hold of my mind. Trouble with memory. I see things I never saw before. Worlds, other galaxies, dark. The lighting seems dark. The darkness seems light. It cannot be real. Hill and church I see in the pitch darkness. Must be retinal impressions left by flashes. Heaven grant the Italians are out with their candles if the lightning stops. What am I afraid of? It is not of an avatar of Nyarlathotep, whose antique shadowy Kethem even took the form of man. I remember Yuggoth, and a more distant Shagai, and the ultimate void of black planets. The long winged flight through the void cannot cross the universe of light recreated by thoughts caught in the shining trapezohedron. Send it through the horrible abysses of radiance. My name is Blake. Robert Harrison Blake, of 620 East Knapp Street, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I am on this planet. Arazoth, have mercy, the lightning no longer flashes. Horrible. I can see everything with a monstrous sense that is not sight. Light is dark, and dark is light. Those people on the hill guard, candles and charms, they're priests. Sense of distance gone. Far is near, near is far. No lights, no glass. See that steeple, that tower, the window. I can hear Roderick Usher. Am mad, or going mad. The thing is stirring and fumbling in the tower. I am it, and it is I. I want to get out. I must get out and unify the forces. It knows where I am. I am Robert Blake, but I see the tower in the dark. There is a monstrous odor. Senses transfigured. Boarding at that tower window, cracking and giving way. I see it. Coming here. Hellwind, Titan, Blur, Black Wings, Yog-Sothoth, save me, the three-lobed burning eye.
That concludes our tale for this week, my friend. Please return next week and we will continue with another short story by H.P. Lovecraft. If you wish to rest some more, please find a space that suits you. Whether you curl up by the fire, partake in some food and beverages in our kitchen, take a nap in one of our many rooms, or take a stroll around the garden, please know you are always welcome at Sniper's Rest, my friend. If you are continuing your journey, the multiverse has some vast and exciting worlds for you to visit. To the north, you have a job to do. It's important. Simply find the things that are wrong, or else you die. It'll be fine. Probably. To the west, you're a giant stone golem, and some folks have just washed up on your island. Help them build a new home in this cozy little place. To the east, you wake from your 3-year coma to find yourself unable to remember how you got here, why you're having these horrific visions, and what the hell these things are doing here. You need to find answers to end this chaos, and end it quickly. And if you're making your own way out there, good luck, my friend, wherever you end up, wherever you're coming from, and wherever you're going. Thank you for spending some time here with us at Sniper's Rest. Remember to take care of yourself, be kind to others, hydrate, take a moment to look out into the world and marvel at how incredible it all is. How incredible you are, friend. Until next time, please take care on your way.